So when you think of the word voice or about someone having a voice, what comes to your mind? First of all, it's probably that there's a sound that recognizably belongs to someone. You could hear them from the other room and you know that it's them instantly. You know it's them speaking. It might be a singing voice. So we can say this morning, our lovely worship band have great voices, can't we? Thank you. You might also think about words as part of voice. I don't know about whether you would think of a cat as having a voice. When we see our cat and he meows at us, Mika, it's immediately clear that he wants food. Or perhaps sometimes it's just because he's happy to see us and he wants to spend time with us. He can actually communicate, but I don't know whether we'd really call that a voice in the same way. It's not quite the same thing. And these are quite pleasant examples, aren't they? But when we talk about having a voice, another way of looking at it is referring to oppressed peoples. So are they able to have their voices heard? Do they have a voice? It's about that struggle of speaking out, isn't it? About being understood, about being listened to even. And often, too often, it's the loudest voice that wins. In all of these examples this morning, they're about our relationships with one another. It describes something about how we relate to one another. We can use our voice and have an opportunity to express ourselves, when we have that chance to foster bonds with one another and to grow and develop together as well as individually, maybe simply to work towards a goal. But without a voice, without the chance to talk, or if no one even listens to us when we do talk, relationships sour. Our well-being nosedives, bitterness and negativity creeps in. And we live in such a noisy world, don't we? Where there's social media saying lots of noisy things, there's the news constantly on, and it always does seem to be negative. And as we go through this sermon series on tuning in to God, we can legitimately ask the question, where is God's voice in all of this? In all of this noise, in all of the things going on? Is God's voice in wars and conflict? Is it in the loudest and the proudest people that we hear? Are God's words on X and Facebook and BBC News and YouTube? Do we hear his voice in our neighbours, our leaders, our friends? It would actually be genuinely interesting to hear your answer to that question. Do we hear God's voice in those things? Because I bet some people would say no, quite straightforwardly. Some people would say yes. Most of us perhaps sometimes. It depends what you think God's voice actually is. Is it this external noise crashing in from the outside, over and against our world? Supernatural, if you like. Or can God's voice rise up from within the natural, the things we're used to, the things that happen to us every day, the words we use, the ideas and the actions we see around us, regardless of who they are? And I know, that's a really big question. We're not going to be able to cover it all today, but it is important to ask that question, I think, if we really want to tune in to God's voice, if we really want to know what God's voice is and how we might find him and experience him speaking to us. And so we're going to glimpse some of these themes we've just kind of been throwing out there a little bit this morning, those themes of noisiness and battling to be heard, God speaking and human voices, as we hear about Elijah's career of being an Old Testament prophet. And then to round off this morning a little bit later, I'm going to give you some practical examples of how I've really experienced God speaking to me, how I've felt it and worked it out and really looked for it. So we can all then just have a go and listen. So we're going to be looking at 1 Kings 16 to 19. We're really going to be like whistle-stop tour, because that's long chapters, too long to go through in any depth. But if you would like to have your Bible open, it's 1 Kings in the Old Testament, chapters 16 to 19. But we really will be whistling through and pointing to some verses as we go. So it's in our Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and we're in the ancient Israelites' kingdom, which has now been split down in two. Today we're in the northern kingdom of Israel. It's also called Samaria. And there's a new king on the throne, but it's not good news. His name is Ahab, and he starts following a foreign god, neighboring god called Baal, instead of the Lord. And he marries a ruthless and morally questionable foreign princess called Jezebel, who sets out not simply to replace God's priests with her own set of priests and prophets, she actually sets out to massacre them. And so enter God's prophet Elijah. Elijah is God's voice to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. God doesn't go silent just because injustice and idolatry are taking over. Elijah says to Ahab, there will be no rain for the next few years until I say so. That's a pretty loud and cocky statement. But lo and behold, the rain stops falling. But as the food and the water dry up, God's voice keeps flowing. So as we skip through a little bit, Elijah listens to God. And God says to travel to a place called Zarephath. Something like that. Can't remember. Where God's already spoken to, already prepared. He's already commanded a widower to help Elijah with food and water. When Elijah meets the widow, she explains she only has a little bit of food and water and oil left. And she needs to use that up to feed herself and her young boy, her young son, ready to die. Ouch. She needs to make a little meal to feed herself and her son, ready to die. That's how severe the famine is for her and her son. But Elijah then speaks God's words, telling her that the jars of flour and oil will not run out. So the woman makes food. The jars remain well stocked. And then for the remainder of the famine, Elijah and the widow and the son live together. They're happy. They are fed. And I love that scene. At a time when Ahab and Jezebel are ridding the land of God's voice, filling it instead with their own ideas and words and actions, and as a consequence, experiencing famine and emptiness. God's answer is to speak to a poor widow and a lonely prophet in a small little corner of the kingdom, bringing them together and providing for them. It's so small and so subtle, but it's a beautiful picture. It's a beautiful oasis in a literal desert of water and kindness. And yet that still doesn't last forever. And the widow's son becomes terminally sick. Understandably, she's distraught. What mother wouldn't be? And so she starts blaming Elijah, asking if he had come just to remind her of her own sin and eventually kill her son. But in that moment of deep pain and despair and doubt, Elijah cares for the son. And he pours out his own heart to God. He cries out his own heart to God, pleading with God to help. What are you doing, God? Raise this boy up. And then In the Hebrew, it says, and it's this chapter 17, verse 22, if you are following along. Then God heard Elijah's voice, and the young boy's breath returned to his lungs. He was alive. God heard Elijah's voice, and the young boy's breath returned to his lungs, and he was alive. And then the widow says a very interesting thing in response when she sees this. Verse 24. Now I really know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord, which is in your mouth, is true. You can also have that sense of realizing that the word of the Lord that's contained in Elijah's mouth is faithful, is accurate, along those lines. But the thing is, she's lived with Elijah for a good while now. She knows that he is a godly person. I mean, she's seen that miracle, hasn't she, of the jars never running out. She knows that Elijah is a godly person. She knows God's voice herself because God spoke to her before Elijah even turned up. But we all know what it's like, don't we, when the tough times come? The darkness creeps in. It sucks the life out of us. But now that God has healed her son, that Elijah has spoken those words, it really starts to sink in that God's words are in Elijah's mouth, and Elijah belongs to God. Just think about that for a moment. It's not just that she recognizes that Elijah is a trustworthy source for God. She looks at him and knows that God's words are in Elijah's mouth, and they flow out with power and healing. God, in that moment, is speaking to the widow and changing her life through Elijah's words, and also through what God is doing around her, what is happening around the widow. She's hearing God through Elijah. She's being transformed by God through both Elijah's words and through what's happening around her. And as we think, therefore, about tuning into God, turning to him, we read God's voice is in Elijah's mouth, and it looks life-giving. When we receive God's voice in our lives, we are receiving Jesus, the Word of God, the speaking of God, whose message was of love and justice and overcoming all the hatred and wrongdoing that poisons us and poisons our world. That's what God's voice looks like. That's what it means to have his words in our mouths. But like Jezebel, social media and noisiness and negativity sucks the life out of us. You know, Jezebel and Ahab were going around turning away from God and doing evil things. It sucked the life out of the land. And when you and I listen to God's voice, just like Elijah, just like that widow, when we hold his words in our mouths, God's transformation and whole life well-being is just starting to bubble up in us, no matter what's going on around us. And so Elijah's story continues. By this point, he's spent several years with the widow and her son, and God tells him now it is time to confront Ahab and restore rain to the degraded landscape. So Elijah tells Ahab, King Ahab, to get his brightest, best, loudest Baal prophets and bring them up to Mount Carmel. The game and the goal is simple. Ahab and Jezebel's prophets will use their voices to get the god Baal to send fire from the heavens, the sky, and consume the sacrifice on top of the altar. And then Elijah will do the same. These prophets shout louder and louder, trying to get Baal's attention. They scream and start slashing their own bodies to make Baal take notice. They call on more people to join in. Nothing happens except exhaustion, self-mutilation, and humiliation. Elijah walks calmly up to the altar, pours water on it several times over to make it even harder to catch a light. And then he speaks to God. Guess what? God's fire burns the altar completely, proving to the people that the Lord is their God. It does then take a severe and uncomfortable turn as Elijah orders the Israelites to massacre the prophets of Baal in a reverse of what Jezebel has been doing to the prophets and priests of God. And whether those were God's words, however you want to take that, it's a very dangerous and serious question that we do need to ask ourselves, but we don't have time for today. Thankfully, we can wait until the passage on discernment instead, which I think is you, isn't it, Emma? Yeah. There you go. You can pick that up again. So, after this great and almighty triumph for Elijah, Jezebel orders everyone to eliminate Elijah. So Elijah runs, he hides, and tells God firmly that he is alone and he wants to die. This time, an angel of the Lord is God's voice and simply tells him to eat and drink and rest. Again, God's words during Elijah's deep depression are edifying. They lift him up, they nourish him. They prepare Elijah for the journey ahead. So Elijah sets out for Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, that place where Israel camped and Moses met with God and God gave them the Ten Commandments. So note that even when Elijah was really ill, Elijah seeks God out by traveling to that place that is so fundamentally connected with hearing God's voice. So just as we heard when Ed preached in the first week, hearing God's voice means to set aside time, making room for God to actually speak or to actually recognize perhaps what God is already saying to us. And so we come to Mount Horeb, and God speaks to Elijah, asking him why he's there, and tells him to go out onto a ledge and be ready, because God himself is about to pass by. And so we read in 1 Kings 19, verses 11 to 13, and hopefully those words will come up on the screen. Chapter 19, verses 11 to 13. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So God at the end there asks him the same exact question as at the beginning. So why all the bravado? An almighty wind powerful enough to break open rocks, but God wasn't to be found in the noise and the destruction. An earthquake capable of shaking our whole world, and a fire capable of turning our lives to ash, but God wasn't there. Instead, there was in the Hebrew the sound, or it's just the same word for voice, of a gentle whisper. And so I go back to the question I posed earlier. Is God's voice an external noise crashing in from the outside over against our world? In other words, are you expecting his voice, if indeed he really does speak, to be so out of the ordinary that it loudly proclaims, "Hear ye, hear ye," unmistakable? But that's not what we see here. Even though Elijah has heard God's voice before and even been God's mouthpiece, in this moment of despair, he's being reminded that God's voice is gentle and subtle. You see, by this point, Elijah was so used to the fire and violence of Jezebel. But God's voice is calmer. It doesn't come in crashing from the outside, but rises up naturally within us, the things that we're used to, so much so that maybe sometimes we miss the whispers that God is already saying to us. And that really is the big point I want to try and share this morning. God is our creator. He knows us from the inside out. He made us, and he is therefore what is truly most natural to us. And his presence and what Jesus did for us in the life, death, resurrection, and ascension is all to make ourselves, more like us, more like we're meant to be than we've ever been before. God's on the inside of our lives and our world. He's not crashing in from the outside. And so if you want to hear his voice, if you want to learn what that sounds like and receive that life-giving transformation and encouragement that it brings, then we need to make space for God. We need to pause and reflect and be prepared to listen. Because we have our senses, our hearing, our feelings, our surroundings as well, our experiences, because God is bubbling up within us. He uses these natural things because, let's face it, if he did come crashing in from the outside, God as God, well, we wouldn't understand him anyway. It's like if he screamed at us in an unknown language. I wouldn't have a clue where to start. So in a minute, we're going to go through some practical examples. But just before we do, we're going to pause. And we're going to sing a song. And we're going to actually call, really, on God to speak to us. That if all those things are true, that when he speaks to us, when we receive his voice and we have his own words in our mouths, we begin to be transformed. We get to hear him. And we get to grow. So we pray, Lord, very simply, speak to us. Open our hearts that we might hear your voice, to see you moving already in our lives, and we just weren't realizing it. To notice you more, and to hear what you want to say to us, and the life you want to speak in us. Amen. So one of the first examples I thought of in my head, particularly in the context of the noisiness and busyness of our world, is actually times that I've spent walking in the woods, or perhaps even it is just walking to the next thing I've got to do. And instead of putting on a podcast or something like that, which I use to learn and for God to speak to me in other ways, but instead of doing that, I allow that quietness. Sometimes I don't want to, either because I'm bored or because quietness means things come into my head and I think about the things I don't want to think about. But actually, in that moment of quietness, I give God that space to just bring things up. Things that, again, I don't want to deal with. Memories, maybe. Or perhaps things completely out of the blue that are about someone else's life that I hadn't thought about at all, or perhaps didn't even know about. But the first thing, therefore, I notice is thoughts come into my head. Ideas, memories. I don't always know whether they're all from God. That's part of the point of listening and learning and getting used to it. They're not always going to be all God. But things start popping into my mind. Again, that's very natural, isn't it? It's very normal. Things pop into our heads all the time. But it can be God. God can be speaking through that. And as I allow myself to pray and reflect and just give that time, I start to feel different inside as well. Just like we heard earlier about Elijah holding God's words in his mouth, or the widow receiving God's words, God's voice. Start to feel a little change. It might only be little. Sometimes I've, as a result of that, really actually felt really joyous, and perhaps that came from a place of not doing so well, but actually I came out of it feeling much better. Sometimes it's not as transformative as that, but it's just a steadiness and a calmness starting to creep in. And I think sometimes it really is a simple formula, to be honest, of coming together with other believers, hearing God's words, hearing songs, praying with one another. And we can think that we have to crowd it out with the right thing to do, or to strain in order to hear what God has to say. And it's going to be loud and clear. But actually, sometimes it just bubbles up slowly and gently. And again, there's a feeling deep inside that begins to change. And you might not know what that is straight away. But something's happening. And again, maybe thoughts start to come into your head when you allow the quietness to come in. You don't have to be great at quietening your mind. It's not about being perfect. I mean, you can imagine what Elijah was going through, the depression creeping in and the thoughts. What are you doing here, Elijah? Well, in the bit of passage we didn't read, well, it's all terrible, Lord. Look at all of what Ahab and Jezebel are doing. They're killing everyone. I'm the last one left. I want to die. You can imagine how much was just flashing through his mind. But no, Elijah, stop. Go out to the ledge. You don't have to be perfect at it. I'm passing by. So as we come together, actually, and just allow that space, things start to change inside of us. We can start to feel differently. Again, thoughts, reminders. One thing that I do here is leading and hosting, particularly at the 6 p.m. service. And as I do, I sort of look out and I'm wondering, what are you saying, God? And so I'm really having to go through that process of listening. What might be you saying? Is that the right thing to say? No, it's not. Won't say it then. But maybe it is. And so, again, thoughts, observations about my week, about what's going on in the world, It could be as simple as an observation. Again, these very natural things. But it feels in my heart quite heavy. Not necessarily in a bad way at all, but just in a way of, that's something. That's something. And so I bring that observation. And then suddenly, and I've experienced this so many times, whether it's an observation, a thought, a Bible verse, suddenly it's meaningful to someone in a way, or it connects with something that the worship leader has been thinking about, and it all starts to line up in the service without any particular planning. It all starts to line up. Again, pausing, allowing those thoughts to come through. And I really do want to stress that sense of our senses, our feelings. One example that I've had fairly recently when leading the 6 p.m. service was a real grip of fear. And I was starting to think, is that me? Am I fearful for my week ahead? And it was really, but no, I don't think it's me. And again, I'm sort of thinking all these things and feeling my way through. And it's very hard to describe. But again, it just felt relevant. It felt heavy. It felt, not in a terrible way, but just in a, And so I shared it. I think, I was feeling something that I believe God was saying someone else was feeling. And it was relevant to them. And lo and behold, later, someone came up and said, yep, that was me. That was me. And it was particularly relevant at that moment. And just very, very quickly, the final example I just want to give, very, very tangible and very, very relevant example to me and my family recently. So as many of you know, my sister gave birth prematurely by 2 months to baby Amos. And, God was there right from the beginning. And everything seemed to go well. But of course, it's a scary situation. We didn't know exactly what was going to happen. And there was, if nothing else, there was just loads of practical questions. And he's now home safe. But there was one particular point where someone just messaged my mum out of the blue and said, because he was born up in Basingstoke, because that's where they happened to be in that moment. So he wasn't down here where they are now. So there was that question of travel and what's going to happen, the practical question. And someone just texted my mum randomly one Sunday, is there any more about him coming down maybe at some point? The staff at the Conquest in Hastings are really good. When I went through that, they are really good. This person in particular is fantastic. And that was exactly the right thing to hear in that moment. It was just a thought that person had. Previously, they'd sent a Bible passage, again, very relevant in that moment. But that one really was just a thought, a memory. And earlier that afternoon, the nurses had first come up to Becca and said, okay, you want to take him to the Conquest? Well, that will happen tomorrow. All out of the blue. And so many questions and so much uncertainty and natural anxiety. But that was exactly the right thing. And just because someone had a thought and allowed themselves to speak. So I really want to recommend allowing that space. Maybe the thoughts you have, the memories you have, the feelings that are bubbling up inside of you that begin to sort of make you feel changed and give you a peace and connect more with God. That is how God begins to speak to us. Just through the natural, just by being present, just through the everyday. So let's just pause then, because it would be remiss of me not to give that moment of quiet after saying so much about it. So let's just pause, because there are going to be things that have been going on in our lives up to this point, in the week, things we're aware of in the world, or perhaps even things that God is bringing up in this service that we're just feeling things inside, emotions, ideas. So let's just pause. So, Lord, as you begin to speak to us, we just pray for more of you. And not to be afraid of it, not to be afraid of you speaking to us and bringing things up. Because you are a good God. You are a good God. And your power and your love and your healing is there to overcome all the brokenness and all the things that challenge us and all the things that poison us. And we just ask that as we transition to a couple of songs of worship and response, that you would continue to speak to us. Amen. We have a prayer team, so don't stop. Let's stand together and pray with one another and just allow God to keep speaking. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. It's not about that. But if you do want prayer, head towards the back, or you can come and grab me. But let's just respond and allow God to keep speaking.